Whilst working on an entirely different video, I realised that I held a lot of assumptions about what certain tactical instructions do in Football Manager. Now, some of those assumptions might be right, others not so much, and so I wanted to dig a little deeper. That's what we'll be doing today, taking a practical look at one specific instruction, identifying what we expect to happen, assessing whether that is actually the case, and how this can impact our choices. And we start with the very first option in the in possession section, width. But what exactly does width mean? Let's head on over to the manual. Width controls how wide you move the ball when in possession. A wider approach stretches the field horizontally, a narrower one funnels play through the middle of the pitch. Width is not necessarily about the positions players occupy on the pitch, but the team's intent with the ball. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. The greater the width, the more inclined players will be to drift wider so as to allow play to occur in those areas. Given a perfectly equal choice between passing inside or outside, your width setting will help guide your players as to the preferred option. If width impacts intent, what do the focus play options do? Essentially the same thing, just more extreme. If we consider width settings to be a guiding hand, then focus play is a proverbial gun to the head. It allows us to be more specific in picking a flank to attack down. So why would you want to play narrow or wide? The most obvious reason would be to augment the strengths of your team. If we take the default tiki-taka here, we can see that width is set to fairly narrow by default. It's a tactic which has a trio of playmakers in the middle, and players in wide positions that like to come inside. It's a tactic centred around quick ball movement and having players in close proximity to one another. By contrast, wing play is set to wide by default. This is a tactic that wants to get the ball out to the flanks and send crosses into the box. This is a tactic that has multiple players in wide positions looking to create overloads. Another consideration might be the weakness of the opposition. In very simple terms, if you're faced against a 4-4-2, you might want to play narrow to overload their two-man midfield. Against a 3-5-2, you might want to play wide due to their lack of support on the flanks, and so on. So let's see how this manifests in FM, which means I need to talk about methodology. In an ideal world, we would be able to control every variable, things like condition, morale, making players consistently perform to the peak of their ability. This would allow us to isolate width and test that and that alone. But to meaningfully analyse the results, you need to establish what impact those controlled variables have. And if I'm honest, I don't think I can. There are too many variables which can't be controlled, and the game has an innate level of randomness. Trying to create a perfect environment would be both abstracted from real in-game situations and full of unknowns, and neither are particularly helpful when it comes to drawing conclusions. Now, this is not a repudiation of those who take that approach. It both has value and is noble. But for me, I would rather take a realistic scenario, warts and all, and assess the practical impact. To do that, I've created 4 tactics. Well, it's one exceptionally basic tactic with 4 formations. Counter-press because I always counter-press, a higher defensive line for compactness, slightly more pressing to avoid being too passive. Not a particularly specialised tactic, but one I could conceivably use. The formations chosen aim to cover what I consider to be the main tactical shapes: a 4-4-2, a 4-5-1, a 3-6-1, and a 3-5-2. Playmaker roles have been deliberately avoided, and no individual player instructions have been given. We will then holiday for half a season with each formation twice, once set to narrow, once set to wide. Why such a short period of time? Because this is around the point in a save I'd be analysing performance, preparing ahead of a transfer window by identifying what might need to be changed and where we might need to strengthen. It's around the point in a season that football hipsters will be writing their op-eds about their new tactical darlings. Now, what are our expectations? The first and most obvious is that there will be a noticeable difference in areas of play. Narrower will be more central, wider will be on the flanks. So how do we measure that? You might assume that the distance between the team's widest players will change. I don't. If you play the ball down one flank, the rest of the team will shift over. If you move to the other flank, you get it. Over the course of time, this will all kind of balance out. But because I assume something doesn't mean it's true. So let's find out. Now, average position over the course of a season is not something we can see in game. So I've screenshotted the average position of the starting 11 in possession from every single game up until the point of the first substitution. Players changing position and role can skew things significantly, and the AI tends to be more active on this front from the first substitution onwards. I then plotted every single player relative to the centre spot, and taking possession into account, I was able to calculate average positions. And I was wrong. The difference in overall team width was marginal, but there was a difference. 3% for the 4-3-3, 6% for the 4-4-2, 0.3% for the 3-4-3, and 4% for the 3-5-2. These are all small enough that they could be explained by natural variation, but there is a trend that all tactics set to wider were, well, wider. But that's not the bit that's interesting to me. The most noticeable difference was the positioning of players in central positions. Those in the centre right or centre left spots seem to be impacted by the width settings more than the wide players. That's not the best way to measure where play actually occurs. For this, we could use the focus of attacks chart. Similarly, taking possession into account, we can identify how much difference width makes. But 3 zones feels kind of restrictive. So let's create average heat maps instead. That's right, more screenshots. This time, touches. The pitch has been divided into a 10 by 12 grid. That's 2 squares for each position group. Goalkeeper, defence, defensive midfield, central midfield, attacking midfield, and the forward line. And 2 squares for each corridor. The flanks, the half spaces, the middle. Then it's just a case of overlaying the grid and counting. Every touch. 152 games. Was it worth it? Probably not. The heat maps show exactly what I would expect to see. The 4-3-3 went from 48.1% of play through the middle zones in the narrow system to 42.6% in the wider system. The 4-4-2 went from 48.5% to 45.1%, a much smaller change, it is worth noting. The 3 at the back tactics had a lower base. The 3-4-3 went from 45.4% to 40.9%. The 3-5-2 went from 46.6% to 44.3%. That is both 2 striker tactics showing a change of width to have less impact. I didn't expect this, but it does make sense. When looking to push the ball forward in a 2-striker system, your main outlets are more central. Which leads me to ask, does width impact passing direction and length? Whilst this information isn't available aggregated over multiple games, it's a lot easier to extract than the previous 2. We can just record what is available through the chalkboard. And here are the results. Narrower systems play more sideways passes. Wider systems play more backwards passes. This is all rather logical. If you have the ball in central areas, you have 4 directions you can pass in, 2 of which are sideways. On the flank, you lose one of those sideway options, and the opposition are going to be more willing to let you pass backwards than forwards. That's reductive, and there's obviously more nuance to it than that, but you get the idea. Interestingly, wider results in more accurate passing. Kinda. 87% compared to 86.2%. It's a negligible difference, and one that can be explained by natural variance. It is still surprising though. I expected narrower systems to have higher pass accuracy as players are in closer proximity. And that would have been the case had it not been for those pesky 3 at the back systems. In the 4-4-2 and 4-3-3, narrower systems had higher pass accuracy. The opposite is true for the 3-4-3 and 3-5-2, and the difference in accuracy here is much larger. It is clear in those systems it is beneficial to space the players out. But how does any of this help us? Which scores more goals or concedes fewer? The answer: narrower. 1.51 goals scored per game, 1.24 against, compared to 1.30 scored and 1.54 conceded. But here comes the asterisk. Narrow did score more goals and generated higher non-penalty XG, but when it comes to XG, the margin is much smaller, 1.29 compared to 1.21. That margin is almost the same as the one for XG against, although this time wider is better, 1.39 XG against compared to 1.46. Neither is significant enough to conclude that one setting is better than the other. In fact, if we look at all the high-level stats, they are much of a muchness. Possession, passes, final third passes, chances created, dribbles, sprints, distance, headers won, crosses. This is one to talk about. Playing wider did, albeit marginally, result in more crosses per 90. Narrower had a higher success rate. Both, it must be said, are pitifully low, but it does appear that playing narrower meant that when the ball did work its way out wide, there were better crossing opportunities. That doesn't, however, mean those crosses resulted in more goals. 89.6% of all goals in narrow systems were assisted. Just over a third of these assists came from the right or left. In total, 0.46 goals per game were assisted from the flanks. By comparison, 93.6% of goals in wider systems were assisted, with 44.2% coming from the flanks, or 0.54 goals per game. So what have we learnt? Width does exactly what the manual says it does. Good job, SI. It's not a magic score more button. There isn't a right selection. Rather, it is supplementary, helping you funnel play into specific areas of the pitch. How you choose to use that, ultimately, is a personal choice. Let's look at a practical application. Aston Villa versus Brentford. Villa are industrious and tidy in midfield, enigmatic on the flanks. I see Leon Bailey as a player I want to get the most out of. Brentford are playing a 4-3-3, and I think that their left side is a weakness. Rico Henry is not a bad defender, but De Silva appears to be the more attacking of their midfield trio, and I don't expect Wissa to provide much support. This is an area I want to target. There are a couple of approaches we could take. Using that same base tactic from earlier, we could look to play narrow, suck Brentford inside, hoping to isolate Bailey against Rico Henry. I do that by asking the left winger to be an inverted winger, adding hold position to the ball-winning midfielder and changing the right fullback to an inverted fullback. We'll play narrow and focus play through the middle. Finally, I change Bailey to a winger on attack. This is all about keeping him as the sole option on that flank. And we can see it pay dividends. As Digne drifts inside from the left, the rest of the team stays central. There is now a lot of space between the main throng and Bailey. That allows Digne to play him in to set up the third goal. Alternatively, we could look to play wide to try and create overloads down the flank. I do that by changing Bailey to a winger with instruction to cut inside. Add stay wider to the fullback and change the ball-winning midfielder to a Mazzala. We'll play wide, focus play down the right and look for the overlap. We are looking to get those three players close together to allow us to play around Henry. We see that bear fruit for the opening goal. Bailey is set down the right and Dougie Luiz immediately comes across to support. That allows a little give and go which gets Bailey in position to send in the cross. McGinn does the rest. Later, we see all three players combining. Chambers plays it into Luiz, Bailey cuts inside, occupying Henry, and that creates space for Chambers down the line. He hangs it up for Zaniolo to make it 3-0. This is to say that there are different ways you can use width to complement your setup, and it's definitely worth experimenting to see just how it impacts your own tactic. Maybe you already have and stumbled across some surprising results. If so, let me know in the comments, and see you next time.